Yeah, well, I need to take a
Hi all, welcome back to the next installment of Yours. I'm very privileged to have Angela Piccini join us today from the University of Bristol, but media and
the film and TV
department. Angela has played an important role, I think, in my career too, because when I was first looking around at how I wanted my research interest to develop, she was one of the few people that was grappling with issues of representation, with multimedia engagement in archaeology and heritage in a meaningful, critical, quite inspiring way. And I'm really pleased then that you could come up and continue to inspire us. And so I won't say anything more other than, for most of you know, we live stream these seminars. If you want to tweet a question or follow along via Twitter, we're on hashtag YOHRS. You can follow up after the fact, obviously, on our YouTube page, U of Y Archaeology. And if you ask questions, your voices will be heard on the question period through the microphone, but your faces will not be seen. So that's all the technicalities, and I'm so pleased to be able to introduce you to Angela then and her talk on Know Your Bristol on the Move, Archaeology, Participatory Mapping, and Community Moving Image Archives. So
Well, I mean, the pleasure is all mine, because it's so fantastic to be coming up here, and thank you for inviting me up. I mean, sitting where I sit in Bristol in the film and TV department, even though I have a background in archaeology, I just look up and I see there's so many exciting things happening at York, and the kind of critical mass, I think, within archaeology and heritage up here is really inspiring. And it's something that I was thinking about how I wished I had back in the 90s when I was doing my PhD, when I think my supervisor, Mike Parker Pearson, probably looked askance. He thought I was going to do something on the Iron Age. And I was like, no, that's all well and good, but actually what I'm interested in is the way in which sort of a Celticized Iron Age was circulating through what at that time was calling heritage media. And I was really inspired. I sort of happened across people like Roger Silverstone. You know, I was sort of scrabbling around in the dark and found this amazing media scholar, Roger Silverstone. He was talking about a range of different forms as media, not just TV, but he was talking about heritage as media, and museums as media, and souvenirs as media. So that's why in my own PhD practice, that was what I actually happened to look at. So trying to sort of mix up a range of different mass-produced forms in order to understand how archaeology kind of makes itself. So, but that was back in the 90s. So today, I've been very kindly invited to speak to you about Know Your Bristol on the Move, Archaeology, Participatory Mapping, and Community Moving Image Archives. I am going to do that thing where people at the beginning of their talk, they begin off the page and it's all very relaxed, and then they say, but I'm going to read a script because otherwise I'll go over time. I'll try and stay off script as much as I can, but particularly Dawn will be very aware of the fact that that's often a dangerous move. So in preparing for today, aside from sort of questions, practical questions of timing and how many words can I fit into 45 minutes, I also had that usual sort of tension between show and tell and critical intervention. So I know that you know, coming to a research seminar, people are working on their own projects. They have different kinds of interests. Some people want to hear examples. Some people want a sort of critical theoretical flight of fancy. I might be trying to do both, so you will have to tell me whether that works for you or not. But also I think really key in these kinds of seminars is about sharing, but also exchange of knowledge. So in this particular project, I'm working with historians, and the city archaeologist, but nobody from the archaeology department. So it's really great to be here, and I would really like to have your feedback, because I know that there's a number of different projects all across the UK and internationally now that are sort of looking at very similar kinds of questions. And certainly I saw Helen Graham's, I watched her seminar webcast. And it's interesting just to hear from her how she's working on some of these issues too. So yes, so I want your feedback as well. So I suppose what I'm going to be talking about this evening picks up on Helen Graham's seminar in terms of the way in which she was exploring heritage, not just as a common good, but as a commons. And I thought that was really interesting because that touched on some of the debates that we've been having in this project over the last couple of years, with its focus on co-production, but also we have incredible input from our knowledge exchange fellow, Nate Eisenstadt, who comes from a geography background. And he's absolutely steeped in this kind of critical literature around commons and common good. And he's been great because he's really challenged us from a sort of history and heritage point of view, where we think, but this has just got to be good, right? It's just got to be good to share heritage with people because they want to know. And he's been asking us the really tough questions that hopefully have pushed us on to think in other ways around this. And also around the question of not just public access to the common, but the way in which we might actually think about actual ownership. So I'll be using language like digital repatriation later on, which some people might be more familiar with from a sort of post-colonial indigenous context, but how might we actually talk about digital repatriation in a British context, and also how might that actually feed in not only to capacity building within communities, but actual income and capital generation. But we might want to question, is that something that we want to be doing anyway? Do we want to be inspiring people to make more stuff that winds up in the landfill? Of course, that keeps archaeologists in a job in the future, but that may be something to critique. I think also today, this evening, is also a kind of conversation, a virtual conversation with Lorna Richardson's critique of digital public archaeology, and also Colleen has worked very much in this field as well, sort of taking issue with a kind of utopian language that archaeologists have been mobilizing over the past 15 years. Is digital public archaeology as emancipatory as we imagine it to be? So I guess I'm going to be talking to sort of, our project began within that space of access and participation, and that notion that in and of itself, digital tools are positive. But we are beginning, I think, to critique that more and more through the project. And I guess the final theme that Know Your Bristol on the Move picks up on is that of the archaeology of the contemporary world. So thank you, John, for coming along. Obviously, York is very well known not only for its heritage and its digital public archaeology, but contemporary archaeology. So that's quite a perfect fit. So how can we, the question really is, how can we productively involve communities in valuing contemporary landscapes, and how we can approach the contemporary through various media forms in order to both promote capacity building and also to think about how we might realize the heritage value of contemporary landscapes, if that is of interest to people. And certainly one of the communities that I'm working with, Northwest, it is very much of interest, and that's framing their sort of future plans. So to do this, over the next while, I'm going to be talking, sort of entering into a theoretical space, talking to you about archaeology as a boundary-making practice, then moving on to the Know Your Bristol on the Move project and giving you a bit of background around that, and specifically its intersections with participatory mapping. And so that will lead on to talking about Know Your Place, which is a map that's designed and built by Bristol City Council, and relating that, comparing and contrasting that with another map that we've been developing in the project, which is Map Your Bristol. Then talking about community tools for co-production, before moving on to the strand that I'm in charge of, which is Northwest on the Move, before sort of exiting out into thinking through some of the other kinds of implications around this work. And I think key to the work and key to this evening are a series of questions. Really questions around, what is the role of personal archives within the public sphere of planning and local history and archaeology? And what does it mean for family records to enter into the public domain and to be accessible in new ways? And how might sharing these benefit or even harm communities? That's one of the questions we've been thinking about in terms of visibility. And equally, how might such sharing throw into question older understandings of neighborhoods in the city? And how might moving image archives present new and challenging questions for archaeologists with interests in media forms and contexts? Okay. So, what is at stake in the contemporary world's work of archaeology? I cut my head off. So, as culture, history, scientific method, and economic activity, we know that archaeology continues to participate in the settling of people and things in time and space as objects of study. Archaeology transforms that which it seeks into the simultaneity and messiness of material discursive life worlds, into archaeological record, into fieldwork reports, into academic conference papers or seminar papers, into landscape characterizations, archives, and objects in glass cases, and of course into heritage. So what's at stake in the contemporary work of archaeology then is the continuing need to account for archaeology's entangled enactments of archaeologists, communities, traditions, habits, technologies, landscapes, bureaucracies, tools, materials, of the past and the present in order ultimately to practice archaeology better. So in that context, what I'm talking about is a Connected Communities project. It's a 2-year project called Know Your Bristol on the Move. Specifically, I'm wanting to talk about the strands in which I'm directly involved, which is the overarching theme of community tools for co-production, so work package 4 and that kind of language, and I have responsibility for that. And also the work that I've been doing within work package 4 as work package 4.2 on Know West and Know West on the Move. So to consider how archaeology productively participates in the liveliness and messiness of connected objects, peoples, histories, and cultures. Part of this, I think, is a call to be critical of moves to elevate participation and involvement as necessarily good, which I alluded to earlier. And how might contemporary community-involved archaeologies productively recognize the co-production that's implicit in all archaeological work, and thus offer a better model for the inductive observations that are at the heart of all archaeology. So such co-production can, of course, be rendered invisible by the apparatus of disciplinary archaeology and its taxonomic tools, which is something I think Colleen and Sarah are looking at in terms of developing different kinds of recording sheets for digital archaeologies. But the question remains, if orthodox archaeological practices create a certain kind of knowledge, does changing that practice create new ways of understanding? In advocating for embracing inductive methodologies, I think our aim on the project is to broaden the scope of archaeological and heritage practice, interpretation, and application, while also maintaining rigor and expertise as boundaries set by community-based epistemologies and critical standards. At the same time, I think we also need to acknowledge the importance of critical voices in the debates about access to and ownership of archaeological heritage. Like Lorna and Colleen, I'm a deeply skeptical, and also Sarah, and probably most of you here. We are all both deeply skeptical, but also very, very energetic producers of social media, right? We're all producing engaged, co-produced heritages as though our lives depended on it, and they probably do. But I also agree with Helen Graham that there's an urgent need also to move beyond the idea of a common good, that maybe it's not enough for us to just be involved in this kind of work because it feels good or that it feels right. And I also have to admit to feeling a certain kind of liberation in speaking in this space as opposed to the space of the project, because of the way in which, despite the webcasting and whoever might be listening in, because this is a critical space, so one can raise these kinds of critical questions. And I think as people located in academic institutions, we have a responsibility and a mandate to ask those critical questions. But when we're working with communities where people are in precarious positions, resources are scarce, community organizations are moving from grant to grant, and we do have an ethical responsibility around where our critique goes and how our critique can possibly impact on people's future livelihood and well-being. So it's an uneasiness. So it's nice being in this space, and clearly criticality is vitally important and urgent as well, but that's also one of the things I feel slightly uncomfortable with or discomfort around. So, but this is one of the things I can talk about, so which is a nice space, although in Know Your Bristol on the Move, the organizations we're working with actually have a really interesting engagement with critical theoretical contexts in a way that another Connected Communities project that I'm involved in, they sort of bribe it, they don't like to talk about these kinds of ideas. So there are excellent conversations in heritage about benefit and value, and there are debates about meaningful inclusion and involvement in decision-making, both face-to-face and through digital means. What I'd like to do is to attempt to connect the heritage and public archaeology discussions with conversations about performative materialities, such that heritage and public archaeology aren't all about human social life, but also signal entanglements with the more than human, that co-production extends to the material world too. So we know archaeology is one of the myriad boundary-making practices that through processes of assembling is something that Rodney Harrison writes a lot about, and dissembling, produce distinctions that create what physicist Karen Barad refers to as cuts in the multiplicity of lived experience. So those cuts through that multiplicity resolve into categories that slip into the always been, beyond question, and commonsensical. So in other words, practicing archaeology is what creates and reproduces what is and what is not considered archaeological at any one time. And by pulling materials together as archaeological, archaeologists resolve the complexity of those materials into that singular category. We all kind of know there's been enough theoretical debate within archaeology back from Shanks and Tilley, and probably earlier than that, how can we actually engage with and hold that multiplicity while also producing archaeological work. So there's always resolutions, there's always closing downs at the same time that every one of those cuts then opens up another possibility. So that's something that we are familiar with, I think, as archaeologists. Normative archaeological knowledges are produced by those cuts, by the literal slicing through the soil to create sections that frame stratigraphies, or the rendering of select subsurface features as data via ground-penetrating radar, or by the modeling of past lifeways according to 20th century European gender norms. These norms have been critiqued as ethnocentric, colonial practices that skew and misrepresent authentic pasts and present communities. But in recent archaeological scholarship, however, a performative turn, drawing on the work of people like Judith Butler, Bruno Latour, Nigel Thrift, and Karen Barad, see archaeology, or potentially posit archaeology, as material discursive practice. That is, archaeology is one of a group of practices that always involve both matter and discourse, and that matter, of course, can't exist prior to discourse, but at the same time, it's not that my speaking is somehow producing stuff. You know, stuff is here, but it is always, of course, always already entangled. Archaeologists participate in observing, as Marcus Britton has said, observing a world that is not unitary or preordained, but becomes manifest through regular, intelligible patterns that emerge not through the recognition and representation of such regularities, but through repeatable circumstances of material arrangement. So rather than simply misrepresenting an authentic past, archaeology is active in the worlding of the world, in a process of objectifying its objectifying relationships. In short, archaeology is one of the key practices through which the world that we and other non-human entities inhabit is produced. This we can think about, Doreen Massey talks about thrown togetherness. It's another way, perhaps, of thinking through this. And this thrown togetherness raises some interesting questions that perhaps problematize the idea of heritage's representation. I think, Sarah, your work with Stephanie over the years, was an interesting tension, I think, that you were exploring within that visualization. Is it representation? Of course it is representation, but somehow to use the language of representation suggests that there is something stable to represent, whereas of course there isn't. The current move away from notions of fixed a priori entities, objects, people, and so on, that somehow precede archaeological representation, together with a more recent focus on archaeology as a process that disciplines matter by transforming it into archaeological record. Both of those two things, I think, enable more nuanced interventions into archaeology's contradictory entanglement with broader relations of capital growth, law, nationalism, anthropogenic climate change, and so on. So it's really about thinking about how all of our practices, of course, can only happen through representation. Those representations themselves produce our practices, and all of these things together wind up disciplining and shaping the multiplicity into these categories in which we think that we can intervene. So how might such a shift in archaeology from a politics of representation to a sense of performative power be experienced? And one response to that might, to the diffuse multiplicity of archaeology, a response that aims both to acknowledge the workings of power and to craft spaces of difference, has been the recent explosion of community-involved archaeologies, especially those, I think, framed by the regulatory structures of the Connected Communities strand. How many people in this room are either working on or have received funding or are researching Connected Communities projects? I was expecting to say more, okay. Got a couple, okay. It's like, how many projects aren't Connected Communities? Despite, or perhaps because of, a shrinking population of academic archaeologists, we as archaeologists remain concerned with recognizing our ongoing role in colonial relations and with our sense of archaeology as a potentially critical and emancipatory exercise in understanding people from the ground up. Although the history of community archaeology is almost as long as the history of the discipline itself, of course, because it's always involved communities to one level or another, it's aligned, but also the way in which it's aligned with community-involved practices across the arts and humanities more generally. The current intensive interest in making archaeology relevant to and accessible by non-professionals comes, interestingly enough, at the very point at which archaeology's main areas of economic activity lie within privately funded arenas. So that is, in the transformation of archaeology in the ground as a virtual commons into the private spaces of condominiums and shopping malls and increasingly privatized spaces of higher education. So that's, I think, is an important and a troubling context for Connected Communities projects, and one, of course, that we're all familiar with. So while the quality of community engagement within archaeological heritage management and its complicity in the forces of privatization are, of course, beyond the scope of this talk, within universities and funding councils, what is clear is that significant resources are now being allocated to community-involved, engaged, and co-produced research. Communities have been quick also to recognize the opportunities and the challenges that this new academic and commercial interest in participation creates. At the same time, there's also a growing critique of tokenism and a concern with the ethics of appropriating and commercializing local knowledges, and how that's now being directed also at university-based community-involved archaeologies. There's two great archaeologists in Western Canada, Marina LaSalle and Rich Hutchings, who write and publish really, really interesting work. And quite radically, they're actually telling archaeologists to just stop, because there is no way outside of that, of the colonizing gesture. It doesn't matter how involved your communities are. Yet it's also perhaps too easy to dismiss the collective move towards locating expertise within communities as simply a cynical exercise in feel-good public engagement, in cost-cutting, or in whitewashing corporate expansion. It is problematic as well to dismiss out of hand these kinds of activities, because that then risks a paternalistic marginalization of communities as in some way unknowledgeable, and it fails to account for the multiplicities of agency, and I think it sidesteps what's at stake in contemporary archaeological practices, which is an attempt, an honest attempt to account for archaeological work as not representing the world out there, but as a key agent in world making. And it's in that context, I think, that Know Your Bristol on the Move operates. So this is a collaborative project between the University of Bristol, Bristol City Council, the Bristol Record Office, and several community groups. And it aims to enable people to explore, research, and co-create Bristol history, heritage, and culture using digital tools, but also on-the-ground IRL tools. As my son would say, if he's watching, he would be shrinking in horror that I just used the term IRL. Know Your Bristol on the Move incorporates 4 overlapping elements. The first one is augmenting the Bristol City Council Know Your Place website, which forms part of the HER, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second activity involves a bus. It's actually a big truck, and it was a chemistry truck. And I think it was also a medical truck, because there's a table on which dissections can happen. We don't do any dissecting, but anyway, it's a truck that we take around to our various events. We've had, in the events that I've been running for Home Movie Day, for example, we were working with digitization, so film digitization technologies on the truck. People come in, they watch stuff, they digitize photographs, they digitize film. So it's kind of a 1970s, you know. That's the other thing about connected communities and this kind of work, is that, of course, it's not new, and it's another iteration of the kind of work that we were all seeing in the 60s and 70s, if we can remember that kind of work. Taking trucks out to people and providing fun events for them to do. The third element is Map Your Bristol, which is an open source, streamlined iteration of the Know Your Place website, and it also involves an app. And the aim of it is more for community organizations to use. They can create their own layers, and they can add points of reference, their own photographs, audio records, video records, etc. So for community groups to map the city as they see fit. And then there's exploring models of community co-production. And so through the use of digital tools like the maps, but also through a number of different kinds of events, we bring people together to explore different ways in which we can create heritage together. But at the center of Know Your Bristol on the Move is a desire to create knowledge with and for the various community groups who are involved in the project. Whereas academics often occupy the position of the expert in university-community relationships, we aim to acknowledge and to utilize multiple forms of expertise that communities and academics bring to the table. And I think through the events that have happened so far, there is an admirable flatness and I think openness between both the community groups and the academics in terms of sharing that expertise. And there's not been the same kinds of wranglings around knowledges and ways of knowing that some other projects are perhaps have been characterized by. But if we're all experts of different kinds, then the challenge is not for one to create knowledge about the other, but to create knowledge together for mutually defined ends and by using collectively designed tools and practices. And so in that way, we sit within the new discourse of co-production, in which co-production has taken up the early writings of Ostrom in the 1970s, and her work with Chicago police in terms of actually co-producing services. So it's been imported from the social sciences, but in many ways feels like collaboration. You know, it's plain old, good old collaboration. So there are a number of different projects that explore co-production in different ways. My own strand, which focuses on media archives, I'll talk about in a little bit, but just to sort of give you a heads up, it involves looking at both home movies and also a community media experiment that happened between 1973 and 1976. So a significant aspect of the project is participatory mapping. Specifically, we've been informed, I guess, by work on mobility, people like Tim Cresswell doing Massive, sort of key writers and thinkers about mobility, and how that might impact on understandings of community heritage. There are myriad participatory maps. There are cultural maps, there are green maps, labour maps, there's maps of historic menus I've seen sort of from the archives. There are maps of disappeared cinemas, activist maps, and so on, maps of musical memory. Some of those might be researcher-led, so Les Roberts at Liverpool University has these great maps about musical heritage and cinema heritage. And others are participatory. UVic is working on a lot of participatory maps through the Open Green Mapping Initiative. And then, of course, there are also artists who have been doing all kinds of maps for a long time, who were engaged in the located media initiatives maybe back in the early 2000s. So using GPS technologies and sticking them on the tops of taxis on a Friday night in Reykjavik to create generative maps of people's Friday night life. So we had them. That was the early 2000s when we had Friday nights. But in our project, we're concerned with various senses of movement and how can mapping actually try to engage with movement. So everything from the St. Paul's Carnival route, so St. Paul's Carnival is like a smaller version of the Notting Hill Carnival, but there are these great archives that show the various maps in which that people followed through St. Paul's. There's other forms of movement, so activist marches that were organized by Action for Southern Africa. So Bristol, I have discovered this year, was a really important site for anti-apartheid activism in the 1980s. And then the work that I've been doing is actually looking at material that moves, so film. How do we deal, when film and video is actually showing you different kinds of sites, how do you deal with a video file on a map, given that it moves around? How do you map movement? How do we incorporate movement and multiplicity within the frame of the map? How do we deal with plural, messy, interconnecting, multi-scalar heritages of the city? It's that old problem of arcs and nodes and of the very firm lines that, particularly when we're working with developers in a university who are signed up to an open source ethos and aesthetic, there's always a really interesting friction there because you can't ever quite achieve what you hoped you could achieve, but maybe you guys have influence a crack that particular one. So one of the ways in which we've been working on mapping, as I said, is through collaboration with Bristol City Council and Senior Heritage Officer Pete Insel, and with his Know Your Place interactive planning tool. So this resource was formally launched in March 2011, and I was involved in Brislington Community Partnership and the Brislington Community Archaeology Project, not with any kind of academic hat on, but just as a punter. And it was great, so that back in 2009, getting to work with Pete to think about this tool and to actually participate in doing some of the annotations of mapping. So it was great when this launched. And so it's a GIS-based resource that layers historic maps of Bristol, which are overlaid on OS maps. And the concept and design brief for the resource was created by Pete Insel and Bristol City Council's design group in partnership with Andrew Ventham of the Council's Corporate Geographical Information Systems team. Make sure I get that properly down. So historic maps include 19th century plans by George Ashmead, 19th century parish tithe maps, the 1902-03 Ordnance Survey maps, and also images from the Bristol City Galleries and Archives, including images from their Breckenridge collection, which show the cities and buildings in the 1820s. And a recent layer has been added, which isn't on that, that's an old slide, but a recent layer has been added, which is Bristol's Film and Video Club, which has been in existence since 1903. And all of their materials were digitized, and one of our MA students from the MA in Archaeology for Screen Media, the last year, she was placed with the Bristol Record Office and was augmenting some of that data, and that's started to go onto the map as well. But really the key thing is that it involves a community layer. So any member of the community can upload material to Know Your Place. It goes through a vetting process, obviously, because it's formally within Bristol City Council, and it is a planning tool, so developers have to consult with it in order to forward their planning and their development plans. And Pete and his team will vet anything that's uploaded. So the web interface provides access to and active engagement with data that should be in the public domain. You can't see that very well. The website is currently being used in schools and will be one of the key vehicles for delivering the Bristol Curriculum Initiative that's creating locally relevant learning resources for Bristol. So I was going to show you this video. I'm not going to show you because I know that there's issues around sound. I will show you a couple of videos in a bit. Oh no, I'll show it to you. I'll show it to you anyway. Yes, so yeah, do the switch over. So I want to show this to you because Pete and his team have been redesigning the Know Your Place site, and they've got a how-to on the Know Your Bristol blog. So it will be silent, but all of our videos are subtitled. So it's that one. Okay. I need to hide it. So for those of you who've seen Pete present before, you'll see that the map looks quite different now, in the way in which you can drag the different historical maps as layers over it. I'll just get to the bit where he does the spyglass. Great. And it takes you on a walkthrough of that, how you actually, in terms of uploading, go to the community layer and how the community layer will correspond with that. Thank you. But a strong aspect, obviously, of our project is that assumption that mapping is a good thing. And also, but there's also been an assumption, which is interesting, I think Pete feels slightly conflicted about that, is that the Know Your Place site, which is complex, but there's an assumption that somehow that's been alienating. But actually, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but the whole issue around working with communities and these kinds of tools is that it's never enough to just deliver a digital tool to somebody. Actually, the magic happens when we're working with people live. And what Pete is very firm about, and I've seen it happen, is that you can work with the youngest school kid and they get really, really excited about this map in particular. And I know that in the strand of the project that I've been working on with the community of Knoll West, although there's been this move towards the Map Your Bristol open source streamlined version, is that actually sometimes the communities want something that looks more like this because it confers value. It confers a certain formality onto their practices. But at any rate, I'll show you Map Your Bristol in a bit. Hi. So to some extent, I think that our project, particularly as it focuses on mapping and the two different approaches to mapping, attends to a critique of all cartographic processes as colonizing practice. So I'm just giving you, I mean, that's just one reference reasonably recent, and it was a reading that Nate, our Knowledge Exchange fellow, brought to us to get us to all to read and think about. Obviously, there's a significant literature on the emergence of participatory mapping across a number of fields that highlights questions of surveillance, knowledge and control, the politics of whose node is placed where, the problems of boundaries, especially where boundaries attempt to settle political and ethnic conflict and strife, the notion of the multiplicity of territory. So where I'm from is unceded shared Coast Salish territory. And certainly Musqueam and Squamish people who live where I come from don't want to settle, they don't want to draw a distinct line, because actually there's a lot of blurring and there's a lot of sharing, and the whole purpose of it is to share. So participation doesn't get us off the hook around that, because we have to explore critically why people are so willing to give up their personal histories to the map. We have to grasp our responsibility, and this is, I think, is where our work connects with Lorna's, on the sustainability and long-term responsibilities that we have for digital heritage, for the use and abuse of maps. And interestingly, there have been some groups who haven't been at all interested in this user-friendly version, as I was saying. So the content of the community layer maps on this Map Your Bristol one, am I going to do a walkthrough? No, I won't do a walkthrough. You can visit it yourself on Map Your Bristol, because again, it allows you, it's a fairly straightforward interface in terms of how it allows you to update stuff. But the content of the community map layers were developed by community groups and researchers, and we're continuing to do that. We were doing that starting in 2013, and we'll be finishing that off in May of this year. To gather content and to sort of excite interest, each group has developed or has employed different methods, from research days to panel discussions and interviews to walks, music gigs, film screenings, and theatrical performances. We also have a schools layer, and the content for that was created by students as part of their year 8 and 9 extracurricular work. The students have also contributed somewhat to the look and feel of Map Your Bristol through user testing sessions in the early phases of the project. But the maps really are just one aspect of the project. Map Your Bristol is very much geared towards being a co-production tool, so a tool used in the liveness of event. We take it to events and we aim to engage people in using it. But the various events that are associated with individual community groups do employ a range of different tools, and those tools will be quite familiar to anybody who's done sort of workshop type events, engagement type events. We work with objects, we work with conversation, we work with walking, and so on. And we work with memory work. And in Know West on the Move, we use film and video. So that's the material that we invite people to respond to engage with, and to augment through crowdsourcing sort of metadata activities. Now, Know West is a suburban community in Bristol of about 12,000 people. It's situated above the River Malago, which is a tributary of the Avon, which eventually empties into the Severn estuary to mix with the waters of the Irish Sea. In Know West, archaeological evidence abounds, and it's the usual mix of things. So people find Mesolithic flints in their backyards, it's medieval stuff, Iron Age stuff, and on and on. But also, of course, takes in the contemporary landscape. So what's interesting about Know West is there have been two periods of estate expansion in the 1930s and in the 1960s as part of slum clearance from the center of Bristol. And the community has participated in a number of local knowledge projects that focus on multi-period archaeology and heritage as part of a longer-term project that's supported by Know West Media Centre. So this is an event that's happening at Know West Media Centre, which is run by directors Carolyn Hassan and Penny Evans. And they're particularly committed to developing ways to hold and to generate and to communicate local expertise, because Know West has been popularly framed as a marginal community. Know West is one of those neighborhoods in the city that is always seen as problematic, pathological in some way. And so the media center is very, very concerned to release the potential around capacity in the community. And so here, archaeology comes to be linked to a range of contemporary issues that touch on planning, education, digital inclusion, health, and capacity building. And they support active engagement in placemaking. So beyond standard techniques of archaeological investigation that have been undertaken on the estate, primarily sort of watching briefs and metal detecting, I think we've been interested in how the estate's long-term engagement with media practice as an observed community. So it's one of those communities that's had many films made about it, but it is also a community that has participated in media making from at least, well, obviously beforehand, but certainly from at least the late 1960s. There have been photographers and filmmakers there. Ken Jones, who's one of the Knoll West elders, has been making Standard 8 films, was making Standard 8 films there in the 1950s. So how can we start to think about those kinds of media practices in the context of as an archaeological resource? Examples of video production within and across the full range of UK archaeological practices obviously highlight the fluidity of archaeology as a discipline within the British context. Diverse uses of video speak to archaeology itself as a visualizing practice, of course. As Clack in Britain, Graves Brown, Moser, Perry, Shanks and Pearson, Tilley, so many have argued, visualization, whether via photography, drawing, computer modeling, or video, constitutes rather than merely supplements archaeological practice. And both Knoll West on the Move, so that's the separate strand, and a separate project run by the Knoll West Media Centre called the University of Local Knowledge, conceptualize and activate video as an emergent archaeological record and as an important mode through which archaeological knowledges are assembled and enacted. So conventional media approaches that adopt an expository mode can enact archaeology's epistemological significance as a rigorous and sober process of knowing the world. So what one might recognize as a straightforward documentary. At the same time, the material relations of video's production, post-production, circulation, and exhibition all invite, I think, potentially archaeological attention. So that is, as much as media practices aim to convey an archaeological narrative, media practices like this, it's very straightforward, short film, these practices themselves enter into the archaeological record through their material relations and residues. In the Knoll West on the Move strand, we're digitizing the archives of Knoll West TV, which came from 1973 to 1975, and we've also been organizing home movie workshops, and so it's to those things I'm going to turn now. Can you, I don't have a time, please.
Yeah, we're getting quite close to the end. We don't have time for questions. I'm going to wrap up this shortly, if that's okay. Do you want to, shall I switch you into
No, you're fine. So back in the initial Know Your Bristol project, we ran a home movie day. So we invited people to bring in their home movies. We had about 50 people all turning up. But what's so interesting about these kinds of events is that people often they'll come along and they'll say, well, I have an attic full of home movies, but I didn't bring them today. But what's interesting is the way in which also that speaks to some of the scholarship on home movies and the way in which the constructed image of the home movie has been thought of as in terms of recording kinship, material culture, and aesthetic preference, and how this has been seen to be essential to the home movie mode rather than being technologically contingent. So home movies have been understood as signifying underlying sociocultural norms, and their photographic representation is argued to directly index how subjects featured in films see themselves. So in other words, home movie images are seen ultimately to be constrained by historically specific ideologies that determine what can be represented and shown. So we ran that event back in 2012, and then in October of this year, on October 18th, it was International Home Movie Day, and we ran two different events. So Knoll West was the site of International Home Movie Day in Bristol, and we had the lorry there, and people brought more films, and it was all very exciting. But of course, the time required to digitize home movies and to actually map them becomes very problematic, which I think ties into some of the issues that we have with time, both in seminars and also time in terms of community-based heritage projects. But in spring, we're aiming to have a further week installation where we actually invite people to bring in their home movies and have digitization equipment on standby so that people can come in at their own convenience. The second aspect of what we're doing in Knoll West is Knoll West TV. So it was Peter Lewis's pioneering Bristol Channel community television experiment from 73 to 75. It was all stored on 1-inch IVC tape, which was held at the British Film Institute in their National Archive at Berkhamsted. And there are only 3 machines that can actually play any of those. And the lifespan of IVC tape was 30 years, but these were all 40 years old. But we managed to get 40 hours of it all digitized. And what we've been doing with that is we've actually, there's the gang all doing the digitization. In November, we had our first workshop where we invited people in the community to actually come in and work at workstations looking at those community media archives to think about how we can actually document places and people that we're seeing in them. And very few people have memories about it, but it's quite interesting. Well, it is quite interesting in the way in which it's galvanized the community. Although around problematic languages that might be familiar in terms of heritage, because it's quite a sort of a cozy sense, so people think of it as the past, and isn't the past wonderful? And one person actually invoked the language of indigeneity. So isn't it great seeing Knoll West at a time where there were more Indigenous people in Knoll West? And talking with colleagues in Western Canada about how the language of indigeneity is slightly more problematic in the UK, and they didn't really understand. Clearly, there is an ethical issue around how we are actually working with communities in these kinds of collections. So you can follow those links on our blog. There's lots of videos, and you can actually watch the stories of how things happened. So what are some of the problems with this kind of work? We create overly ambitious activities. We're tyrannized by the time to do good community work. You have to devote lots of time to people, time that isn't costed within your projects. There's also the sense of the utopian. And also we don't want to be necessarily pushing people, forcing people, giving people a sense that they should be committing and contributing their personal archives to this project. What does it mean for them to do that? What does it mean for them to make these materials visible? So at Knoll West, the limits of what is understood to be archaeological practice can be tested by the mixed practices that happen in and with communities. Work with photographic images and with a city archaeologist propels new understandings of the ways in which archaeology isn't just about ruined materials in the ground that have outlived their usefulness. Instead, any engagement with ideas of pastness relies on contemporary materials and their stubborn persistence in the present, and their projection into the future through a gesture of archaeological inquiry. Now, I know I need to finish up. I'm sure I haven't been speaking for 45 minutes. Just trying to think what I need. There's a lot of gumph in here about returning back to theory, so I'll put that on the blank slide. And I think to summarize, let me just see what I really need to say. So I think what we're doing is we're continuing to work through questions of how all of these activities potentially contribute to the communities that we're working with. With Knoll West TV, there is a real sense of digital repatriation. The videos are now owned by the community and they're being looked after by the Bristol Record Office. Workshops also bring people together, and so there was a real impact, particularly around older people in isolation, because as we know from heritage projects, it's often about bringing older people together. And home movie workshops can operate in the same way. But how are we going to measure benefit? And how do we identify it? And would it be through the identification and protection of a site? Would it be through the transformation of this kind of landscape heritage into capital-producing activity? There's also been talk about souvenir production. And in Old West, I guess, an approach is focused on the archaeology of the contemporary world as having the potential to activate archaeology as an everyday and accessible practice that contributes to more collective understandings of the everyday. But I think, as I said before, there are these assumptions about cozy practices and safeness and heritage. So how do we also mobilize heritages as risky, as potentially dangerous, but in a way that also holds that ethical space? I think participatory research with communities can help to identify the gaps between performed memory and the practices within the photographic frame and on the screen, which can contribute to an archaeological understanding of the built environment as emergent. Cornelia says, today we're all archaeologists, yet is it possible to create meaning through working with these tools of the master? So this question of mapping and this constant drive to map, and to what extent does that actually free up people or constrain people in terms of how they engage with archaeological practice? Certainly, we know that neither our disciplines nor the representational practices that perform them are transparent, and we treat visualization as mere illustration at our peril. So just to finish off, I think these are the traces that remain in our community involvement, and that the circulating artifacts of film and video are unpredictable and can be dangerous. The ongoing challenge is to work with communities in a way that call attention to our situatedness and to try to align this work as archaeological praxis. And I think as well, the sense of paying attention to the forms that these take through a reflexive criticality within community-oriented projects is not a panacea. And it may be, at the same time, one of the few ethical positions that we can take in our implicated gestures of working with, on, for, alongside the labor of communities. Boundaries collide as part of the messiness of multi-federated networks of archaeological practice and theory, and community-founded practice is an emerging cause of productive interdisciplinary collision. Our collective work in the West, by virtue of insisting that practices not normally embraced as archaeological are situated as such, call attention to the contingency of all knowledge making, and we hope warmly invites a broader archaeological community to become more involved in the collective process of world making that community-involved archaeologies offer. So, thank you. So we can see you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating, incredibly articulate, and I have some questions, but rather than hog the floor, I'll open it up to the rest of you. Do any of you have queries for Angela? Sorry. We'll come back to you, Tara.
You talked about the use of photography and video, and I was wondering, looking forward to the future, if there's any provision in things like interactive media, or is this sort of like game-based media, where the producer is a lot the person that's taken in media itself, and how you deal with those kind of challenges?
Well, that's the great thing about collaborating with the Media Center, is because now these archives have been digitized, they're usable by anyone. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're actually inviting applications for 2 artist residencies to work on the project. So we're hoping that an artist will come in and actually work with the Norwest TV archives in some way and sort of open those out of space. And in terms of interactive technologies, absolutely. Bristol's is the site of iDocs, which is interactive documentaries. So the materials are there, but until they were digitized, they couldn't be used. But we're hoping that future projects might do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, yeah. I'm interested in this concept of community. Obviously, it's a tagline which attracts funding. In a broader sense, community is obviously a representation of a demographic in an area. the people that you seem to be appealing to are a self-selecting community who may not actually represent the demographic. Do you think that's true? And do you think that's important? Does it actually matter?
It is important, it does matter, they are self-selecting. And so, in terms of the community layer, so in terms of the Map Your Bristol, so the actual tool that we're developing, it causes a lot of debate because actually there are different kinds of communities. So there's a Afro-Caribbean community within Bristol, which isn't necessarily geographically bounded or demographically bounded. What's connecting them is the notion of music. Then we have Action for Southern Africa, again, which is a different kind of community. Null West, the community that's being represented, is a community that's curated and framed by the media center. In terms of the theoretical literature on community is often framed as something that one develops because of a lack, right? It's not that you share all of these things. What you share is you're sharing a sense of lack in some way. So, but I think it raises issues around mapping because mapping fixes and it feels very solid. And I think one of the things we would like to do in the future, or we would have liked to have done within this project, is to find ways in which the mapping tool itself could somehow bring that up and bring up the fact that community is always being negotiated and is porous and is intersecting and is overlapping. Does that answer?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting approach to say that it is, even though you have a community, it is still accessible to other elements of that demographic. I think without that, you probably fail in some areas. So it's good to see that we recognise that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Kat had a question. Yeah, really, really fascinating, and you basically articulate what I've been struggling with the last year. And I wanted to come back to the sort of the uncomfortableness about sharing or having a critical space to engage and to talk about all of this, but then thinking back about how would you talk to the community? I mean, were there specific examples of times when you found that it was difficult to get past the language barrier between sort of the academic in you and the...
No. I mean, I think that's the thing. So early on, I said about the problem of kind of a patronizing. It's not that you're being patronizing, but that we need to be wary of that. And I think, what I found back in the days when I was doing my PhD, and the same in this project, when you actually are in the room with people and you're having conversations with people about the construction of the past, there's never a barrier. I've never found that people had trouble with these. So even in events, there was a great event that my colleague Justin organised, which was around music in the Trinity Centre in Bristol. And those questions around, well, where does community begin and end, and whose community and who has the right to speak about community, were all being articulated. And this was a panel of musicians, mainly men, but there were women there as well, who were sort of in their 50s and 60s, so a particular generation of Bristol music. But they were very alive to the fact that the story they were telling was partial and was constructed, but was an important story to tell. So I've never found it, and it's something about the event, and it's something about using objects and tools within the event of conversation and using that to spark debate.
So I think my question builds a little bit on Tara's question, in that I'm interested in kind of interventions into the video, and particularly it's really interesting because we do a lot of re-photography in archaeology. We're redoing landscapes, and it's fun, right? It's a nice thing. Oh, look how things have changed. And I think it's quite interesting that people have been doing this with family photography as well. Look, we were kids together, now we're big adults, and isn't this stupid? But and so I was wondering if you thought about doing some re-videography in that, and actually, because it would be incredibly complicated and incredibly hard, but it would actually turn into a performance. I think it might be actually interesting to redo your very great archaeology film, Gutter Snipe, and kind of have another person try to go along with it. or one of the historic videos, and you could either do it side by side screen, or you could fade in and out between the two different registers. But you couldn't do more than like 5 or 10 seconds at a time because it would just be too hard to coordinate.
Yeah.
Have you thought about reusing film in this or other ways?
Interestingly enough, absolutely. So
Yeah.
we've only just been able to watch the Norwest TV videos because we only got them from the National Film Archive in November. And one of the first things we thought about was actually doing re-performances.
Yeah.
So what's from a social history point of view, there's all sorts of interesting stuff about early feminism and gender, and there's these interviews on the streets about do women have the right to work, and there's even a bra burning, which looks great on this early video because the fire makes this tremendous flare. And we were talking about actually trying to apply for funding to get those same people, to get new people into those places and have those same conversations and do precisely a video project.
Fantastic.
But certainly, I mean, in terms of interest in place and space, absolutely, because it's about how do we get this material to inform planning processes. So how do we're not yet at the point where we can actually map this material, but given that Norwest is a community that feels as though planning has been done to it rather than with it, how can we use these kinds of records to inform a planning process so that you can look at a site that was a field or was a church or was a 1920s home and is now something else, and actually bring that into decision making around heritage and planning.
I haven't been able to formulate it properly, so we'll see what comes out. But I was interested at the beginning when you were speaking about kind of archaeologists worlding the world and the sort of disciplining process. And the thing that I find really interesting about the discipline is that when you look back at its history, a lot of practitioners over time have actually been quite engaged with media. So, presenting on television, they're there right at the foundations of like the first TV shows. Archaeologists are on the airwaves, and they're in film, and they're on radio, and they're and then experimenting with new media and all of this across the whole history of the profession. And so what I find interesting about working right now is that it seems like the institutional infrastructure is kind of finally caught up in some ways with what people were already doing for ages. And the institutional infrastructure is then kind of binding you in a fashion that is essentially the opposite, I think, of productive. Or I wonder if it is with ref and impact and all such things. And I was wondering where you thought things were going to go next, or whether you feel, because I guess the point is, and that's why I don't know that it's an answerable question, but I was like, there are archaeologists, outworlding the world, and in fact creating a very interesting profession, and then everything else is kind of swallowing it up with, trying to impose a form of engagement that's already been at the foundation of the discipline in some ways. So I'm interested to see what's going to happen.
And that is a live topic. It must be something that you discuss here. It does the disciplining of engagement wind up emptying out all of the energy. But at the same time, as academics, our time is quite constrained. So if it's not disciplined, if we don't have workload allocated to it, if it's not funded time, how will we have the time to do it? Because it's not the same industry that it was before. And we were talking beforehand about there's nothing. I would really like to be spending a lot of time making stuff, but there isn't the time to do that unless you buy that time out, in which case then the logics of it don't quite operate. So I don't know. that sounds despairing, but
the disciplining of engagement is a phrase that I'll be using. Thank you. No more questions, but thank you so much. Very inspiring. Lots to think about, and such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Back next week with Matthew Tyler Jones, who's going to be talking about gaming and different forms of narrative and other engagement. So hope to see you then. Thank you. It was great.